Thanks for joining us for the Plato's free webinar on what's best for you, the different P4C approaches. I'm joined today, my name is Ariel Sykes, and I'm a board member of Plato, and I'm joined today by 4 colleagues of mine who practice P4C in various different contexts to talk to you about what they do and for me to lead them in a discussion. As you listen, make sure that you put your comments in the Q&A at the bottom, and I will spend time at the end of today's webinar after our colleagues have a few minutes to share a little bit about themselves and their practice and answer a few of my questions. We'll open up to open questions. So go ahead, put that in the Q&A chat and I'll read them out. All right, so we're going to begin. We're first going to start with Maughn Gregory, who is the professor of educational foundations at Montclair State University, where he directs the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children. He is the co-editor of the Routledge International Handbook of Philosophy for Children, Routledge 2017, and the Routledge series on Philosophy for Children founders, which includes In Community of Inquiry with Anne Margaret Sharp, Childhood Philosophy and Education, 2018, and Gareth Matthews, The Child's Philosopher, 2021. He serves on the John Dewey Society Board of Directors and is the inaugural research coordinator for the International Council of Philosophical Inquiry with Children. Welcome on, and go ahead and share a little bit about your practice in philosophy.
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Ariel, and thanks to Plato for bringing us all together for this event. This is really fun for me. So I'm going to talk about the traditional Lippmann-Sharp approach to philosophy for children, the approach developed by Matthew Lippmann and Anne Margaret Sharp, beginning in the late 1960s and continuing through their deaths. They both died in 2010. And the approach, of course, that they developed was they evolved that approach, and then it has been evolved a little more since then. So I'm just going to talk briefly about that. First of all, I want to just talk about the purposes of this program of philosophy for children as they understood it, and as I actually agree with. Really comes from an idea, John Dewey's work on art, his book Art as Experience, in which he talks about philosophy. He talks about aesthetics as part of a dimension of meaning of most people's ordinary experience. So he said some people think of aesthetic experience as something you go to a museum to experience, or a concert hall. And then the rest of your life is sort of devoid of artistic or aesthetic meaning. And he said that's just silly. If you're awake to it, there's beauty and ugliness everywhere, on the playground, in the dining hall, in this room, in our classrooms, in our schools. He called that the segregated view of aesthetics, and he said we need to have a continuous view. And so we think of all the traditional domains of philosophy in that way: aesthetics, politics, epistemology, metaphysics. They're aspects or dimensions of the meaning of everybody's ordinary experience. So philosophy is not something esoteric. It's something that is there. If you have eyes to see it, it's sort of everywhere. And it's part of the dimension of the meaning of experience, of human experience, that is ironically not often given a lot of time in a lot of schools. And so that's another reason they thought it was important to help give children the opportunity to philosophize, to sort of recognize these dimensions of meaning of their lives and talk about them and figure them out. So that's the main purpose of the program, is to give children that opportunity to think about those dimensions of meaning. And the way we do that with them also, of course, gives them the opportunity to practice careful thinking, to widen their perspectives by hearing what other people think and other points of view brought up in the materials we use, and of course how to collaborate with and disagree with people who think differently than you do, and how to learn that we really need to talk to people that think differently than we do in order to clarify our own thinking and strengthen our own thinking. So the prompts that Lippmann and Sharp famously developed included specifically written philosophical novels for children of different ages. And these novels, I think of them as curricular novels. They serve pedagogical purposes. So first of all, they make the philosophical dimensions that crop up in children's lives obvious, so they're right on the surface. These novels model good dialogue, and they model children going through an inquiry process with each other and with adults. And they also model different kinds of thinking strategies and thinking styles. I don't know if are the people here in the webinar able to look at the chat? I'm just going to put, no, they can't do chat. Okay, well then I won't share that. I won't share a link. So the way we do it, we will, first of all, let me say that the limit sharp approach usually begins with one of these kind of curricular structured philosophical novels that sort of makes the philosophy obvious. But then the idea is that that can be supplemented with any other kind of children's media that has a philosophical idea in it, or current events that are going on in the school or in the neighborhood. Once we start to develop this philosophical ear and we start to recognize philosophical issues, we can really use anything as a stimulus. And famously, Matt Littman invited Gareth Matthews to begin his editorial, his column called Thinking in Stories in the Philosophy for Children journal at the IPC, in which every issue of the Thinking Journal, page 1 of the issue was a new review of a children's book by Gareth Matthews that had some philosophical meaning going on. So the way we do it, the process is we will read a story together or act it out like a play. And then we have the students, the children, generate questions that they want to talk about, that they find interesting. And we usually, especially in the beginning with a new group, we work with them on making their questions more philosophical. We don't sort of do that for them, but we help them appreciate what could be really philosophically interesting in their question. Often that involves children in schools are used to asking sort of reading comprehension kinds of questions. And we try to take those and turn them into more philosophical questions. And then they really get the hang of that pretty quickly. So once we have their agenda of philosophical questions, we decide together with them on where to begin, which question to start with. Sometimes we vote, and sometimes we have a discussion about what would make more sense to begin with a question that might help us lead into another question. And we go for it. We start to inquire through dialogue. And in the dialogue, the children usually call on each other to speak. One person speaks and says what they want to say. And then they'll call on someone else to speak, and it goes on like that. And then the facilitator who's with them in the circle, the teacher or the facilitator, can jump in whenever they need to facilitate. And the facilitator is doing a number of things. One important thing the facilitator is doing is tracking, what we call tracking the inquiry, sort of keeping track of where it's going. And we have a kind of a roadmap for sort of what we call the arc of inquiry, where we begin with a problem or a question, and we're trying to arrive at the most satisfying answer or the most reasonable thing to believe about this question. And so in the process of getting there, a lot of possible answers or hypotheses will come up in our discussion. And so there's that really important creative phase. And then at some point, we want to start to narrow down on what's most reasonable or what's most satisfying by reasons for and reasons against, examples, etc. We also like to, because we think of philosophy, as I said, as a dimension of experience, we like to think about ways that we can test out our ideas in life outside the dialogue circle, and then come back in and report on that and see how that changes the way we think about it. And we always end with a reflection exercise. So the community is sort of self-assessing. How did we do as a community of philosophical inquiry? Did a lot of people get to talk today? Were a few people dominating, that kind of thing? Were we thinking carefully? Did we miss some assumptions? That kind of thing, which helps us sort of step back from the inquiry and take a look at it through the criteria that we have developed as a community for what makes a good philosophical exercise. And the last thing I'll say about this is that Littman and Sharp and many colleagues with them created these very thick, sort of unwieldy manuals. One manual, an instructional manual that goes along with each novel. And for each chapter in each novel, there are a lot of exercises and discussion plans. And the idea is that in between the sessions, while the students are discussing a question, that discussion may go on 2 or 3 sessions. And in between those sessions, the teacher will look through the manual and see if there's something that can help us deepen our inquiry. So there are discussion plans that sort of break open a concept and help us look at different aspects of a concept. And there are exercises that give us a little bit of practice in maybe some reasoning skills or inquiry skills. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maughn. We're going to move on to hearing from Claire Cassidy, who is a professor of education at the University Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. Her research interests coalesce around 3 main themes: philosophy with children, children's human rights and human rights education, and childhood studies. She leads the postgraduate certificate in philosophy for children and the EDD philosophy with children at her university, and runs professional development training sessions for practitioners nationally and internationally. She has enjoyed facilitating philosophical inquiry with children and adults in a range of settings for over 30 years and remains enthusiastic about introducing new groups to the fun and challenges that is philosophical dialogue. Welcome, Claire, and we'd love to hear more about your practice.
Oh, thank you very much, Ariel, and thank you very much for having me generally for this. I'm still trying to go over that last bit about for over 30 years. That just pains me greatly. So if you could put on a gauze over the camera screen, that would be really nice. Okay, so how do I follow Maughn's very concise and clear introduction to his practice? Well, I'm going to talk about community of philosophical inquiry as developed by Catherine McCall. So Catherine worked closely with Lippmann not long after she finished her own postgraduate studies, her own doctoral studies. And the story that Catherine tells is that she was charged with leading some professional development sessions for teachers, and Lippmann had been very clear with her that, you know, she should only be registering teachers for these courses that worked with more children that were further up the stages within school, if you like, so not young children. Catherine screwed up and registered teachers that taught in the earlier stages of the primary school, couldn't go back and face Matthew Lippmann, so decided to evolve his approach and merge it with an approach that she'd developed while she was a doctoral student studying philosophy at university. So there are similarities and there are some differences. One thing I think that's important to say is that her approach is built on particular assumptions. So the first assumption is that as human beings, we have the capacity to reason. It also assumes that we're all creative, whether that's creating meaning for ourselves or for others, that there is an acceptance of fallibility, so everything can be wrong, including ourselves, and that therefore means that everything is open to question. So that's what it's built upon. We don't have any manuals or plans as part of the approach. So once a practitioner is trained, a facilitator is trained, you can do it with almost anything. So like other approaches, we begin by sitting in a circle. The facilitator sits outside the circle, so that the facilitator can observe the participants, so that the participants take ownership of what's going on within the dialogue, and so that they don't defer to the teacher or the adult in the space, really. It begins with a stimulus, a reading aloud of a stimulus. The stimulus is chosen by the facilitator, and that is philosophically loaded. It might be a newspaper article, a short story, an extract from a novel, could be a video, a poem, song lyrics, and so on. And after the reading of the stimulus, which the participants do, they're invited to provide any questions or puzzles about what they've read or that have occurred to them during the reading. The questions are recorded verbatim, and then once they're completely recorded, the facilitator would read these back to the group. the facilitator then chooses the question, and the facilitator chooses the question with the most philosophical potential as they see it. And then there's a structure that are a set of rules that follow as a consequence of that. So the facilitator chooses the question and we throw it back. So if we were doing a dialogue just now and I chose Maughn's question, I would ask Maughn to kick us off. He'd say something about what was interesting or puzzling, or he'd maybe make a stab at beginning to answer that question. And thereafter, if anyone wants to comment on what Maughn has said or what anyone else has said, the participants have to put their hands up and they have to wait to be called, remembering that they won't necessarily be called in the order that they raise their hands, because the facilitator is trying to juxtapose the different perspectives within the group and anticipate the different ways in which the participants might think. When you begin to speak, you have to begin by making a connection with something that's gone before. So the participants have to say either I agree with or I disagree with something that's gone before and give their reasons. They sometimes will say I agree and disagree with someone, or they'll say the thing that children are very good at is I agree with Maughn, I disagree with Jana, and I agree with Roger, and I disagree with Ariel, and they give us a whole string of contributions about their various agreements and disagreements. But the key thing is that they have to provide reasons for those agreements or disagreements. They are not allowed to refer to an authority for the reasons, so they can't say they disagree with Roger because they read it in a book, their granny told them, they saw it on the television. It has to be their own thinking, but it doesn't have to be their own opinion. So it's a space where people can try out ideas without it necessarily being something that they hold personally. They are not allowed to use any technical language or jargon. So if they're talking about, I nearly said football, and then I realised that most of the people here call football soccer, right? So if they know lots about soccer as part of their example, then they have to explain it if it's a technical thing. Or if they know lots about philosophy, then they have to explain. So we try not to use any technical language. It's everyday language to make it as accessible as possible to everyone that's participating. We don't try to come to a conclusion or a consensus. When we get to the end of the session, time is up and that's it, finished. So there's no reflective comments, or we don't come back to anything. The idea is that by not coming to any conclusions or any consensus, we leave things open and participants hopefully go away and carry on thinking and chatting amongst themselves. And I think what we could say about community of philosophical inquiry in this method is that it opens various avenues rather than trying to answer a particular question. So the inquiry itself is more important than getting to an answer that we might all agree with. I think the other thing that I would maybe want to finish off by saying is that the facilitator intervenes for two reasons. One, to encourage participants to follow the rules, but eventually they internalize the rules because it is a practice, so we get better over time. And the other interventions are around clarity. So the facilitator doesn't actually join in the dialogue other than to perhaps say, can you give an example for that? Can you explain the distinction you're making between those two terms? Can you say a wee bit more about that? So really the questions only relate to the things that have actually come out of the participants' mouths. We don't start to invent our own questions at all. And I think that word tracking that Maughn used is actually really quite helpful. So the facilitator is watching and listening carefully to what's going on in order to try and move things forward. So the facilitator's loyalty is to the dialogue rather than to the individuals within that dialogue, which sounds harsher than it is in practice. So I'll leave that there. I think that's my time up probably.
Thank you so much, Claire. Now we're going to hear from Roger. Roger Sutcliffe was the founding member and past chair and past president of SAPERE, Society for the Advancement of Philosophical Inquiry and Reflection in Education, the UK's national charity for philosophy for children. He is also past president of ICPIC, the International Council for Philosophical Inquiry with Children. He is the director of DialogueWorks, which you can visit online, www.dialogueworks.co.uk, and the author of Thinking Moves A to Z, Metacognition Made Simple, a complete program for the explicit teaching of thinking. He has published articles in numerous journals and was co-author with Stephen Williams of the Philosophy Club and Newswise, and co-author with Barry Heimer of Pocketbook P4C. Welcome, Roger, and we look forward to hearing about your practice.
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, everyone. I'm still trying to get over the slip of your tongue, which was probably not something you noticed, but you described Claire as ecstatic. I think you described her as ecstatic. Well, look, her enthusiasm came through, but I hope you do have moments of ecstasy as well, Claire. And I'm not getting at you, Ariel. I just thought it was lovely. Okay, so I think I'm not going to try and match the two previous speakers in terms of detail around how we do stuff. I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I'm firstly going to talk about who the we is, because I've just said we, and you know, I'm one of several who follow a similar approach here in the UK. And then I want to talk about how I see P4C relating to the broader picture of education, really. That relates to Maughn's point about purpose, and P4C definitely has, if you like, a philosophical purpose, which is to enable youngsters to experience philosophical inquiry and to get better at it, and in a sense to get better at being philosophers. But what is it to be a philosopher? That's of course a philosophical question. I'm not going to be tedious about that, but my thought is that education itself needs to be philosophical, and that philosophy itself is educative. And those are two big statements that I can't really unpack now, but I will give you some detail on that later, because it's part of my own evolving thinking and practice. Okay, well, so that's the big picture for me. And so the we, well, look, Ariel's kindly mentioned SAPERE, it's sometimes pronounced. That doesn't matter, it's an acronym. And I checked it out with Matt Lipman 30 years ago. He was happy with it. I think he liked the emphasis on reflection as well as inquiry. And I'm sure both Claire and Maughn agree that, you know, being reflective is an integral part of being philosophical. You can't separate those two out. Okay, so we set up the charity 30 years ago, having liaised with Matt and Dan in America. But immediately it was, for us, inherently unlikely that the English audience, and I'm talking essentially about teachers, really, English teachers, would take to the American novels. It wasn't really a matter of style, although they are very American at some points, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, other countries have adapted the novels, and I did a revision of Harry Stottlemyre myself, which was used a little bit initially, again with Matt's approval. But essentially, we didn't think that we could develop P4C in the UK just using the American way, if you like. So quite quickly, Karen Morris, name some of you might know about, developed the use of picture books as a stimulus for inquiry, and that's now, I think, widely accepted. Tom Wartenberg in USA, Tim Sprott in Australia was using picture books as a stimulus for inquiry pretty much the same time, the early 90s. And so in the UK, similarly to what Maughn was saying, we tend to use now almost any stimulus that we, or recommend any stimulus that we think could be not just appropriate to the age range, but has philosophical depth. That's up for grabs exactly how you recognize that and how you develop it. But there's a certain sense in which some stimuli seem to be richer philosophically than others. Okay, then the process that we have is pretty similar, more similar to the one outlined by Maughn than the one outlined by Claire. I guess part of the evolution in the UK was around, again, the nature of the beast, as it were. Teachers in England are very test oriented, have very tight timetables. Maybe that's a universal thing, I don't know. But it does mean that in promoting P4C, we hit upon, well, we don't have time for this. We'd love to do it, but we don't have time. So we had to gear the structure of a session somewhat around an hour. And it wasn't necessarily going to be an hour every week. And so it wasn't going to become regular and so on. So nevertheless, by hook or by crook, we established P4C as we understood it. There is a handbook. There are lots of resources on the SAPERE website, etc. And I think I'm just going to pause there and say I no longer, well, I never did work for SAPERE. I advised it. I did a lot of work for them, but not as an employee. And so I'm an independent person, and my own company, Dialogue Works, in the last 5 years or so has been, if you like, forging a different pathway. And I'll just speak briefly about that. I was a teacher from, well, year dot, 50 years a teacher. Sorry, Claire, I'm not trying to beat you up there, but I need a bit more gauze, I guess. 50 years a teacher. And for at least half of that, I was really interested in developing thinking, developing children, developing human beings. That was my focus. And I got frustrated, to be absolutely honest, 10 years or so ago, although P4C was quite well established in the UK, certainly well recognized and well respected, it simply wasn't having widespread impact in the mainstream of education because of the exam system, all sorts of stuff, really. But I think that predominantly the problem was that it was tending to be boxed in. So oh yes, we do philosophy once a week. And as Nick, my colleague, says, that's a bit like saying, well, we do thinking once a week. And, it's not a good model. So I started saying, well, how can we take the practice, the skills, the attitudes, the dispositions of P4C into the wider curriculum? And so based very much on Anne Sharp's thinking, but based also on my experience as a teacher with inquiry-based learning, dialogic teaching, I have developed a framework. I call it philosophical teaching and learning, 6 intertwining strands. Obviously, we've got our own way of training teachers in that and helping them to practice good P4C, but importantly, to take the skills of facilitation and help the students take the skills that they learn in P4C into the rest of the curriculum. We don't have massive people taking this up, but it's a good idea, and I think it's got legs. Even more than that, and I've probably got less than a minute, have I, Ariel? Have I got -2 minutes? What have I got?
You got 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Well, that's okay. Well, even more pointed than the philosophical teaching and learning, PTL as I call it for short, is another scheme, framework that I've developed called Thinking Moves. Ariel mentioned it. Again, it arose partly out of a little bit of frustration in P4C because, lots of people talk about, yeah, it's good. You start thinking about thinking in P4C. And that's true, but often the second thinking there refers to the content of thinking, not the process. So you're thinking about other people's thoughts, not their thought processes, and certainly not your own thought processes. Now, if we're serious about developing thinking as a skill, or as a set of skills, as it really ought to be seen, then I thought we need to be much more precise about what we're talking about. True to say, Anne Sharp and many others in P4C list all sorts of, if you like, moves, philosophical moves, they're often called. So I think Maughn mentioned spotting an assumption. Claire might be saying, you know, spotting an ambiguity, and you try to resolve an ambiguity, and so on. Okay, so that's fine up to a point, but I wanted to go even deeper than that, and so I started thinking about the very basis of human thinking, and I was at a workshop with Art Costa, Habits of Mind. Some of you may know that. And I hit upon the weird idea of having an A to Z of thinking, literally an A to Z. And you might be thinking, well, that's ridiculous, Roger. Why did you even start that? I mean, how can you get a Z? Actually, Z is zoom. Zoom in, which we often do. Zoom in on this concept, zoom in on what someone said, or zoom out. What's the big picture here? Are we really answering the question? It's a really good move. Zoom, okay. And then why? What's why, for goodness sake? How do you get a move that begins with why? It's yield. That's ever so important in P4C, in argument, in life, you know, learning how to accept other people's points of view. Maughn mentioned it himself. So actually I have this complete list of A to Z, A to Z, as the Americans call it. And I'm increasingly finding it useful in my own life, my everyday life, but I'm getting really good feedback from both teachers and ordinary people saying, this really helps me think well about my own thinking. And it's not just your thinking, it's your feeling and your acting. So come end really where I should have started, which is what's for me, the real purpose of P4C and of philosophical teaching and learning. It is what it always was in philosophy. It's trying to lead a better life. And how do you do that? You examine your life, you examine your thinking. That is a philosophical project. And incidentally, it's not just philosophers who do that. Some philosophers get a little bit, I think, arrogant in assuming that they're the only people who are experts in thinking. No, not at all. You know, scientists are really good thinkers. And actually, they're philosophers as well, because my last point is this. Yeah, time's up. So sorry, get carried away. My last point is this. People talk about philosophical ideas as if they're a sort of separate category from all the other ideas, and then there's scientific ideas and data. This is nonsense. Actually, all ideas are concepts. All concepts are fit for philosophical inquiry. So science teachers are philosophers, and hence they should become more philosophical in their teaching of science, which basically means thinking even harder than they do. End of story. I need to go to bed.
Thank you so much, Roger. All right, we are going to hear from our last panelist, Jenna Morlone, who is the Executive Director of PLATO and the Affiliate Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Washington. She's the author of the book Seen and Not Heard 2021 and The Philosophical Child 2012, co-author of the textbook Philosophy and Education, Questioning and Dialogue in Schools 2016, and co-editor of Philosophy and Education, Introducing Philosophy to Young People 2012. She's also the author of many articles about young people's philosophical thinking. Jenna has been leading philosophy sessions with students from preschool to graduate school for more than 25 years. Welcome, Jenna.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm so happy to be here with all of you, and especially 4 of my colleagues who I cherish. And I guess I would say what Plato does, our approach to this work has lots of similarities with what all of you have said. And so I think I'm going to start first by focusing on the purpose as we see it, and look in particular at the phrase community of philosophical inquiry, because for us, I think the sort of standout word there is community. And while we of course focus on the philosophical and on inquiry, really the work in many ways, I think, prioritizes the building of a community. And by that, I mean building a community that is empowering to all its members through making spaces for the students to think for themselves about the things that matter to them, and giving them more tools to communicate those thoughts more clearly, to understand themselves and each other better, and as a couple of you have pointed out, and to be able to listen to each other and to be open to other perspectives. It really is, as Roger said, about leading a better life. And I think that maybe there's no greater gift we can give to young people than the kinds of skills that allow them to trust the way they see the world, to be confident about expressing how they see the world, to recognize how unique their points of view are. And those kinds of skills and the way in which knowing why you think what you think and being able to articulate that really can help you to navigate through life and to take control over the circumstances of your life in the way that for many children, that is really a challenge. I think the central kind of piece of this is taking children seriously, which, as we all know, is not an experience that many children have very often. Listening to their questions and ideas in the same way and with the same attentiveness that we listen to other adults. And so when we conduct an inquiry with children, we really follow the interests of the children. So like Maughn, the children ask the questions and determine what topics get taken up. And like Maughn, we work with the children to help them think about what makes a question a philosophical question. But we're not there as kind of the philosophical experts, because even the question, what makes a question a philosophical question, in some ways assumes that there is a kind of closed set of philosophical questions, which of course there isn't, as I think Roger pointed out, and I mean, all of us to some extent know this, right? But I think when what children think of as philosophically important can really widen our conception of what counts as philosophy. And so we try to come in with sort of an openness to what will make the conversation philosophical. I've had so many experiences over the years in which a child will ask a question and I'll think, I don't know, that doesn't really sound very philosophical. And I'll just be completely wrong about that, because it will lead into a conversation that ends up being deeply philosophical, in part because it started with a genuine question that a student had. And so part of this is seeing philosophy as needing children, as I think Maughn has written about, as contributors to philosophy. And so the inquiry is not always governed by what the adults think of as philosophically important. And so, like many of you, we use all kinds of stimuli: picture books, other children's literature, thought experiments, games and activities, many of the ones that were created by David Shapiro, who's been involved with Plato and our work for a long time. The Lippmann curriculum, art and music, film, kind of like Claire, anything that we think is philosophically suggestive. And we look for prompts that feature diverse perspectives and are created by people from many different backgrounds. We work with children from lots of different backgrounds. Our priority population is K-12 students who come from more marginalized communities. Many of our students do not have English as a first language, et cetera. And so we really look for picture books and other prompts in which the students with whom we work see themselves. And Plato actually has a toolkit on its site with many prompt ideas, and it's open access. And so people are free to use all of the resources that we have up there. One of the objectives we have in an inquiry is to foster as many voices emerging as possible. So one of the things we think a lot about is expanding ways to participate, because we're aware that many students face barriers in entering a large group, fast-moving conversation. And we're also aware of the power dynamics in the classroom that often mirror the larger society. So we provide lots of alternatives to large group discussions, such as small groups, turn and talk, silent discussions in which all of the conversations are carried out in writing, journals, art, movement, etc. And we try to kind of provide lots of different entry points for students to come into the inquiry that doesn't always have to include sort of the large group conversation. And we also have been thinking a lot about silence as a form of participation, and particularly paying attention to the silent spaces in a conversation as really fruitful moments for students who are less quick to jump into a more fast-paced discussion. So we work to make sure that there's a wide range of entry points and a wide range of topics are open for exploration. And sometimes those topics can be not so comfortable for some of the students. And we talk about how the community of philosophical inquiry needs to be a safe space for all the students, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be a comfortable space, and that we need to be able to address topics like race, for example, that for some students can be very sensitive in a way that both brings in all the students and also is unafraid to recognize some of the structural inequalities that we have in our society. Because really what we want the students to recognize is that every member of the philosophical community is necessary. And so if there's one student who if that student left the room, we wouldn't notice, something's wrong with what we're doing. And so we do, as I think Claire and Maughn both put it, we track the discussion, but in addition to paying attention to the inquiry, we're really paying attention to the participants and their level of involvement and engagement. I think of the facilitator, I love this phrase that Matt Lipman wrote years ago, the facilitator as a talented questioner, because I think that is maybe the most important role the facilitator plays. And it's, as my undergraduate and graduate students will often point out, it's a lot harder than it looks when you start to do it, because you really need to be able to ask questions that kind of make connections and enhance the conversation's philosophical depth and point out other ways of looking at things without taking control and knowing the right time to ask a question and the time to just let there be a space for the dialogue to emerge on its own. And it's tricky. And, you know, after having done this for all these years, I would say I make mistakes in it all the time. And, you know, that's sort of part of the process. And then I'll just end by saying that I think closure is really important in this, because we're dealing with topics that are unsettled and that don't have final answers. And so, as several of you pointed out, we do always provide some kind of reflection time. It can either be just a reflection about the dialogue, how it went, either content of the dialogue or how many people spoke, that kind of thing. Or sometimes we do some kind of creative expression like journal entries or art or a group poem or something like that. And I think I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Jana. So this opens the time in which we'll be doing some question and answer with the panelists. I'll start, but I'll be fielding questions from the Q&A, so don't forget to put those in there, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So one of my first thoughts when hearing all of you speak was trying to figure out what pedagogical commitments kind of tie all of the different practices together. So I'm going to mirror back what I think I heard, and then any of you who feel like I misconceptualized a commitment that you have in relation to each other, please correct me. And then I'm going to ask some follow-up questions to poke each of you a little bit in areas where you didn't cover as much as the person before, to see if there are differences in our pedagogical commitments in our practice. So it seems to me that all four of you would agree that doing P4C is important because philosophy is meaningful. It creates meaning in our lives, and it's part of what makes for a good life, and people need to engage in that at all stages of life. And that within that, there is the need for us to develop thinking capacity, reasoning capacity, though we might all do it differently. So that's one point I want to hear about, how we might all focus on what it means to be philosophically rigorous or focusing on reasoning and thinking in our different practices. And it also seems like we all agree that we are all fallible, that we're all able to change our mind, that it's worthwhile to listen to diverging points of view and being questioned on what we think and why we think. And then I also heard a commitment to making sure that whatever practice we engage in is focused on students generating interests. So their questions and their emerging ideas is the focus. And that's not the teacher as sage on stage who's dictating where the conversation goes, but it's a student-led, facilitated, supported practice. And then I heard to varying degrees that there's important to talk about like the metacognition process of thinking. in inquiry and doing that philosophically with a group of people, as well as generating community. So you mentioned like sitting in a circle, making sure all voices are heard, ways in which we can include all learners. So the areas where I'd like to hear a bit more from each of you is this idea about like, what does it mean to be philosophically rigorous or focused on reasoning? And I'd love to hear that mainly from you, Jana. And from Montclair and Roger, Jana brought up this important point about the part of community and the phrase community of inquiry. And so I'd love to hear from you three a little bit about how you foster community through your practices. So Jana, how about you go first, since I asked you about the cognition, inquiry, reasoning part, and then the other three can build on the community part.
Sure. So, right. I mean, kind of central to thinking, learning to think well and develop confidence in your own thinking and being able to express your point of view, I think is kind of rigor in being pushed to give reasons. I mean, students will sometimes say how it's a lot easier to say what you think than to say why you think it. And I think that most of us would agree. And one of the things we try to do in an inquiry is both as the facilitator, kind of make sure that students are giving reasons, point out when reasons are inconsistent, maybe come up with counterexamples, but also to help the students to do that for each other and to kind of be able to ask each other, you know, I don't really understand that, or this doesn't make sense to me, or why do you think that, or et cetera. And so we talk about how you can, it's a lot more powerful to be able to articulate what you think if you can really give good reasons for your thinking. And those reasons need to be reasons that other people will find compelling. And at the same time, be able to see that no matter how compelling your reasons, someone might have maybe equally or close to equally compelling reasons for holding a different point of view, and kind of being able to hold both of those things together. And so that you can evaluate reasons and be able to see when someone's reasoning is, when a set of reasons is stronger than another. But at the same time, you're able to recognize that even when you think you've given very good reasons and say that the group concurs that you have, that you still might be mistaken, that it still might end up that there's another way to look at whatever the question is you're addressing that would lead you to at least change your mind in some way about what you have said. So there is definitely within the, I mean, the inquiry is central to the building of community. It sort of all works together. Is that an adequate answer to your question, Ariel?
Thanks, Jana. Would anyone else like to jump in on how they understand the role of reasoning or philosophically rigorous inquiry before we move on to the community part? Okay.
There's a worthwhile silence for you, I think. Silence is assent in my case. I thought you put it beautifully, Jana.
Maughn, would you like to jump in?
I was just going to say that Matt Lippman is one of the things he's infamous for. I use that word, is trying to introduce logic, at least, you know, a certain kind of Aristotelian syllogistic logic to middle school students. And his reasons for doing that, I think, have been misunderstood. But I think I do think that in his own pragmatist kind of leanings, he thought that learning class syllogisms and hypothetical syllogisms, there's just another tool that we can use in trying to figure things out that are important to us. And that he was actually he started his work with Harry Stottlemyre, the novel for late primary school students, because he believed Piaget, that's the age in which children are able to actually work with that kind of logic. And so I think and then he tried to figure out what kind of thinking moves and skills and language skills do children need before that, work on so that they're ready to tackle the syllogistic logic at that age. And in the earlier novels, he would reinforce those kinds of skills. And that kind of systematic view of sort of a development, not in a lockstep way that as Piaget, not in a stage way that Piaget worked it out, but some kind of sequential a sequential vision of what it means to reason well, that that begins even in preschool, and that builds on that a philosophy curriculum would sort of build on year after year after year, I think was hugely ambitious. And so the way Lippmann did it was quite successful to an extent, but I think that idea, I would love to see other people take that idea and do more with it.
Roger, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do actually, because I think I'm going to come to Lippmann's defense and yours, I hope, quite powerfully, Maughn. There's two things. The first thing is, I don't think we can separate reasoning from concept formation. We form our concepts by reasoning about them. And what's more, if we have well-formed concepts, then we can define them. And that means essentially saying all X are Y, this sort of thing. And if it's not an X, if it's not a Y, then it's not an X, and so on. So I think that logic is actually built into the very beginnings of language. And probably you do agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, formal logic isn't, and that's the nub of it, in one sense, the criticism. You know, can little children handle formal logic? So here's a for instance. I can't say I've ever actually heard these precise words, but I'm sure we can all imagine something like this. There's a child at the seaside crying its head off, and the mother says to the child, "If you don't stop crying, you won't get an ice cream." Now, either the child completely doesn't understand that at all and never will because they're too young, or they'll stop crying. If they stop crying, it's because they have understood the logic. What is the logic here? This is a hypothetical double negative. They won't understand what I mean by that, of course, but they understand the hypothetical, I've lost it, the double negative. So my thought here is simply that if we help children to, in a sense, not to do formal reasoning, but just to think things through, then that's the job that we should be doing. And I don't think we need to grandify it by calling it logic. I mean, if it's, I've lost my thread a little bit, but I just don't like this notion that logic is for the 12-year-olds plus and all that. We're doing it all the time. We're doing it all the time. Sorry, that's that.
And to add on to that too, I think that, like, Roger, your dialogue work stuff is building on the spirit of the discussion plans and exercises from Lippmann Sharp's model, where it's the belief that we need to exercise particular focused skills so that we can apply it during inquiry and in our everyday life. And so in that way, you are embracing this idea of teaching logic through the teaching of thinking moves that then get reincarnated into inquiries and different subjects.
Thank you, Ariel. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole alphabet, but I in the alphabet is infer. Infer is to draw a logical conclusion. Not always a logical conclusion, but that is one. And teachers are teaching this in English primary schools. They sometimes get a bit desperate that the kids can't draw inferences, but that's the deal. And they can, of course, they're doing it all the time. It's just that we tie them down to doing it in our way or in our time. Yep, there's me going off.
Yeah. So I'm going to put a pin in that because I know there's some questions in the Q&A about like what it means to be trained well for being a good facilitator of these sessions, and perhaps it's something to do with these being aware of these thinking moves and skills and how we support students in inquiry about that. But we're going to circle back to that because I want to make sure that we get to the community part of the community of inquiry question. So Janice spoke very in depth about her commitment to building community within her P4C practice. And I'd love to hear first from Claire and then briefly from Roger and Maughn about how you build community in your practice.
Yeah, I think it's, I don't think the word community is used lightly. And I think there's a danger that people describe it as a community when we stick a group of children together in the one space. And I think we have to be careful of that. So a community has a common purpose and a shared endeavour, I would suggest. And in generating questions together and in engaging in dialogue together, so recognising what others bring to the dialogue, building on other people's ideas, and recognising the need for others in order to do so, I think goes a long way to creating community. I think Jana's example of if a child's missing during a session that's normally there and their absence is conspicuous, I think that suggests that we've started to establish community. Community doesn't happen after one session. It's something that evolves. It involves respect for others. It involves attention to others. I think the other things that we might do are modelling particular behaviours or particular dispositions in other parts of the day. So it's not just about when we're having an inquiry session, where we create an ethos within our classrooms that encourages and fosters questioning, argumentation, and so on. And I would think, I'm conscious of time, so I don't want to speak too long, but one other thing that I think really manifests itself quite often in philosophical inquiry with children is humour. And certainly as part of my own research, humour has been something that's emerged that I think is a central part of community. I think we've got this idea, I nearly used a Scottish expression, that we can be a bit full-faced, we can be a bit serious when we're talking about doing philosophy, and we think that we're all sitting there stroking our chins. And actually, when children engage in dialogue, it can be very funny. They use examples that are humorous, they draw parallels to things that are humorous, they even tease themselves about some of the things that they're saying. I can think of, there was a group that I worked with for a while that were in young teenagers in secure accommodation. So these are children that have committed very serious crimes. And we were doing some community philosophical inquiry, and they would even laugh at themselves and say things like, I very much disagree with myself. Now, in that kind of context, that was exceptionally unusual. But they all laughed at that, or they all laughed at saying things like, I don't know what I'm saying. Oh, come on, somebody else. Even that, I think, suggests an element of safety within the group, where these very, very vulnerable young people are in a space that's highly charged, but they feel comfortable in a group of people that are in effect strangers. Because I think we shouldn't assume that because children are in a class or a group together that they're all friends and family members, you know. So I think that humour and safety play a really important part in creating community, particularly when we're trying out ideas that we're unsure about.
I agree completely. I love that, Claire. That rings so true to me.
Roger or Maughn, would either of you like to jump in about how you foster community or know when it's happening in your practice?
I was thinking about the, I often show the parts of the that 1989 BBC documentary where when they came out and filmed, and a lot of that is Catherine McCall with the first and second graders. And my college students are just flabbergasted at how the kids are saying, oh, well, I disagree. And it's mostly disagree. Well, I disagree with so-and-so because she said this, and I think blah, blah, blah. Well, I disagree with what he said because blah, blah, blah. And there's no anger, there's no animosity, there's no hostility. You can tell the kids are really friendly and they're really enjoying it. And they're just really excited by these ideas. And I think particularly in today's culture, what I hear over and over and over from my college students is, I don't want to be judged. Like, you know, their experience in social media, anything they put out there, there's 1,000 eyes looking at it and responding and liking or not liking. And so they're just astonished. And I think, and it just goes to show that that sense of safety that you're talking about is there. And it, like you said before, and like Jana said, it doesn't mean it's comfortable all the time, but it can be uncomfortable and we can really deeply disagree. But the experience of having deep disagreement with people who still respect you and are curious about what you think, like if your first reaction to somebody who disagrees with you is curiosity, wow, you really? Tell me more. Is so refreshing that I think it's a real signal that we have community. I just wanted to add another idea that I think is tied to this, and this is the idea that's the very complicated idea of caring thinking that Matt and Ann worked on. And what I want to say about that is that they thought about it in quite different ways, as many people have written about, but I think their difference is in emphasis. So on the one hand, Matt would be emphasizing the idea that some of you have already suggested, that we have to have community for the sake of inquiry. Because if anybody's ideas are stifled, if anybody doesn't feel comfortable talking, or if you don't feel comfortable disagreeing, the inquiry suffers. We're not doing good inquiry. We're blocking the road of inquiry, as Chris said, if we don't have strong community. And that's why, and he's, when Matt's writing in that way, he's of course referring back to Peirce, who's credited with this idea of a community of inquiry in academic disciplines, particularly science. And Ann's emphasis is on more like Jana was saying, that we have inquiry as a way of building community. Like the community is the most important thing, and doing good inquiry is one of the ways that we build a strong community, and that's what we really want. That's our main goal. Really paying, I think for Ann especially, paying close attention to people in their individuality was huge in the community, and she was really good at modeling that, at picking out when a student's comment signals that they have something really unique to say or different perspective, like drawing that out and kind of celebrating that, even if you know it's going to be an unpopular opinion in the group, showing the value of that. So I'll stop there for now.
Right, I think I can be fairly brief. And you've stolen a bit of my thunder, really, Maughn, because I was going to quote Matt in one of his books. He says people usually think that it's community that builds inquiry, but this isn't an exact quote, but actually it's inquiry that builds community. And that's an echo of your point, Claire, that through the very process of inquiring together as a community, you just become a stronger community. But that is provided that there is, if you like, the right ethos. And that's largely the facilitator's responsibility to cultivate, I think, at least with children in the first instance. And so my second point is this, that one of the 6 strands of philosophical teaching and learning is virtues valuing. That's what I call it, virtues valuing. Now, I think P4C has always valued virtues, but like implicitly. And I'm thinking that we should be much more explicit about the virtues that we value. And this is, for me, broken up into personal, social, and intellectual. So we might well focus a lot on the intellectual virtues, reasoning, curiosity, and so on, reasonableness. Of course, we want to build collaborative virtues. It is a collaborative enterprise, so respect for others, friendliness, I think, comes very much to the heart of it. Humor, in a sense, you know, humor is a social thing as much as a private thing, but also personal virtues. That's like being more patient from the very early stage. We teach, train, whatever the word is, children to take their turns, to be patient. And that's a skill for life. Well, it's more than a skill, it's a virtue for life, because patience is a virtue. And we should celebrate that.
Yeah, just one more thing. I want to put kind of a wrinkle on it. And people might not agree with me, but I want to say that, like Matt also says in one of the films, that something like, it's not a community of solidarity. That might not be the word he uses. But I think sometimes it's important, and I know it's different, like in a context of a classroom, especially with young children where they're going to be together all year, that there are other dimensions to that community that are important and reasons why we want to build community in that context. But in a community of philosophical inquiry, I think it's not necessarily a community of friendship. So I may say, I'm so glad Roger is in my philosophical community, even though I don't really like the things he says, and I'm not going to invite him to my birthday party. But because of that, I'm really glad he's there, because he always shakes up my idea, and he always makes me think harder about why I think what I think. In other words, we're not necessarily going to come out liking each other. It's not that kind of community we're aiming for. Although that often happens, almost always happens. But it also sometimes happens that a community of philosophical inquiry that's together for a few weeks, we're not all friends at the end, but we respect each other. You see what I'm saying? Like, the ideal is that it's more like a democratic ideal among citizens, that we respect each other, we value each other's viewpoints, we're glad that they're there, maybe like in a jury. But it's not the case that we're necessarily going to all come out as friends. It's not that kind of community.
Although I would say, Maughn, that in my experience of facilitating groups with adults over the years, very often I find that people couple up. There's something very intimate about sharing our personal thinking. I don't know how many of the couples last, but there's a lot of people couple up.
Yeah, very, very nice. Can I quickly agree and disagree with Maughn, to use that phrase? I agree that people might be very different from us, and that we might not choose them as friends. But I think there is a distinction between being a friend and being friendly. And it seems to me friendliness is a disposition that we should try and cultivate pretty much universally.
I appreciate you saying that, yeah.
Also, I would say we value lots of people who aren't necessarily our friends. So a community can be made up of people we value in many different ways, and maybe none of them are our friends, which of course raises a whole question about friendship and all of that, but yeah.
I feel like we have an inquiry about friendship right now. What I do want to do is I want to shift the discussion just a little bit, because there's a lot of questions in the chat about what to do as a good practitioner. And I think a lot of people are here because they want to improve their practice. And so the following questions, I hope that you try to answer it in a way as like helpful tips for somebody who is new to P4C or who has been doing it a while and wants to refine their practice in some way. And so the first one is, we want to say that community is important and inquiry and reasonableness is important, but how do you do that when Roger has pointed out that in some contexts, you're going to meet irregularly with a group, or you might only see that group once. So how do you foster this rigorousness of inquiry and community in sporadic or just one-offs?
I mean, there's no question that it's way more challenging to try and create a community of philosophical inquiry in a group of 10 people who've never met before, and you meet once for an hour and a half. I mean, so the best you can do, I think, in a situation like that is maybe create sort of gestures toward what a community would eventually look like. And certainly you can use all of the sort of questioning and moves and listening and all of the things that you can model and help the group to do within the context of that short time. But I think, as Claire said, I mean, community takes time. And I mean, I guess it could be a kind of a micro community or a glimpse of a community. Maybe there's moments of community in that time, but I think it isn't something you can just do in a short period of time in one meeting, which isn't to say that something of value can't come out of that in any event. I mean, even if you haven't created a whole community of inquiry, you might have given people an opportunity to think together with each other about something that matters to them, to kind of see a different perspective, to see another pedagogy, another way of engaging with students, all of which can be profoundly valuable.
And hopefully leave them with a spark of something that takes them out into the wider community. So if they've only got an hour or an hour and a half experience, that when they go out and meet their friends or their family or move into whichever circles they're going into, they start to talk about the thing they were talking about for that hour, and they start, you know, so it grows.
Okay, I'm going to move on. I want to voice this question because I think it's an important one for those of us who, you know, relish in community of inquiry, to be, you know, mindful of how other people may see it as problematic. So if anybody has a brief answer to it, if not, I'm just going to put it out there for all of us to mull over as we leave this session. So one of the question prompts was, do children in schooling, compulsory schooling, where they're forced to be there, K to 12, have the right to not view their classmates as a community? Challenging this underlying assumption that community is valuable and something we should all encourage other people to have. Any immediate responses?
Yeah, I think I'll give a top of the head response to that. I think that's a bit like saying, have I the right to opt out of humanity? Because I think, you know, in a sense, what we're trying to model and advance in the classroom is not just the classroom community of inquiry, but what it is to be a person, a good person, and a person in a larger community. Okay, so you've got to handle such a comment and person very carefully, because they're no doubt hurt and they may well be friendless and all the rest of it. But if we're talking rights, no, I don't think they have the right to say, I'm not going to be part of the wider community. That they'd have to go off and be a hermit if they wanted to do that. That
said, they have a right not to participate. So
no, I certainly agree with that.
Yeah.
But in a funny sort of way, non-participation could be a contribution to a community.
Well, I was going to say that because I noticed that somebody asked a question about silence, and I think that how we think about silence and the right to silence actually is really, really important. That participants have a right to silence. But as facilitators, we have to learn how to read that silence. So is it a silent protest? Is it a pregnant silence where there's thinking going on? Is it apathy to what's happening in the dialogue? We have to understand that silence, but certainly our participants have a right not to speak if they choose not to.
And perhaps balancing the whole notion of rights, and this isn't far from original, is responsibilities. I mean, the community has a responsibility to anyone present to try and enable them to feel at least comfortable, well, not comfortable, but safe, and a potential welcome member. They may just sit in the corner in a huff, but you know, that's a concern. That would be a concern, yeah.
But I think that we talk about silence as a form of participation. And I think what Claire said is right, that you have to kind of, you don't want, there's silence that is disengagement, and there's silence that's reflection, and there's a way of incorporating silence, both because it slows things down and makes a lot more space for people to think and speak in a more measured way, but also to think about how to have silent participation be a part of the inquiry too, by using things like art and writing and other forms of communication. And I would just say, in response to the original question, I'm not sure I entirely agree with you, Roger, because I think that in the context of compulsory schooling, where the child has no control over how his or her education is conducted, to kind of want to opt out of that seems to me, in some sense, to be justifiable. And I think it's a very complicated question, and we need to think about it much more than we're going to be able to today. But I think that there is something about feeling like this is just one more thing I'm being coerced into doing. And I'm not interested, as a way of really protesting the whole way in which sort of learning in a particular structure is forced on students, and for some of whom the conditions of the way school works just, is really oppressive.
Yeah, no, I'm hugely sympathetic to that point of view, but I think, and I'm not coming back just to extend the argument, but you're right, this is very complex. And I think one of the things that is a singular virtue of P4C, however it's practiced, is that it's essentially antidotal to the sort of compulsory education ethos that you're talking about. It's antidotal in many ways, but that's one of the ways. And in a sense, you somehow want to convey that to such a student and say, actually, this is your home because we're with you.
Okay,
And
so
I just want to add briefly on that. I love it at the end of an inquiry when I'll sometimes ask the students, so if instead of discussing this for the last 45 minutes, if we had just taken the question we began with and I assigned you to go write about it for half an hour, how many of these ideas that we put up on the board would you have come up with? And would you end up with the same, would you think about it in the same way as you're thinking about it right now? And they always say, oh, no. And I like to emphasize how can you possibly know what you yourself think about something if you haven't had the chance to try to articulate a thought and make it accountable to a community of your peers who have the chance to push back on it and make you clarify and make you justify and ask you, but you didn't think about this and what are you assuming, right? And hear many different alternatives that you might not have thought of. How can you possibly do your own thinking? Think for yourself if you don't have a community. So it's in the sense, it's not like I'm asking you to sacrifice something personal so that you can build this community because the school wants you to build a community. It's sort of like, if you really wanted to think for yourself, if you really want to know what you believe about anything, you've got to have the benefit of this kind of process.
Okay, so we have time for one last question, and I'm going to try to tackle two of the questions from the Q&A in one. So one question was about what are the indicators of success that you all look for to know when a philosophy for children session goes correctly? And I'm going to attempt to summarize what I've heard so far to lead into the next question. So I've heard that you look for excitement and curiosity, that wonder, that engagement in the question and the thinking with others, that you look for there to be instances where this participants feel safe in disagreeing or safe in not knowing, of expressing doubt, that you look for the thinking and the reasoning through ideas, through being able to agree and disagree and respond and challenge assumptions. You look for different considerations of perspectives, that all voices are being heard and that we're not being siloed into particular ways of thinking. Is there any other indicators that I missed that you think are essential for knowing when a P4C session is happening?
I think sometimes it's afterwards that children have returned to it, that it comes up again, or they make reference to it again later in the day or later in the week or later in the year. So I think sometimes something's been successful long after the event. Smiling's also quite a good indicator, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's always the case. I think sometimes when we're thinking hard, the last thing we're doing is smiling.
I think you might have covered most of it, Ariel and Claire, between you. But when you put the question, I had an almost instant answer of my own. So whether it's in sync with that, I don't know. But I think firstly that it's very presumptuous for anyone from the outside, and I don't just mean an observer of the inquiry, but outside of an individual, to assess whether much progress has been made. Because so much of it goes on in the heads of the however many people there are, and we share a tiny fraction of the thinking that goes on. because only one person can speak at a time, but hopefully 20 plus or more are all thinking hard. So I put this back to what's the individual, the subject, or the subjective even measure of success. And I capture it in a simple question, which is, have I thought wider and deeper? And I don't actually have definitions of wider and deeper here, but I think everybody knows when they've encountered an idea that they hadn't ever thought of. Well, that's widening their understanding. And that they've gone deeper because they thought that they had an answer or that this was simple. And then the more they think about it, the more complex and the more interesting and so on it gets. And if every person at the end of an inquiry says, yep, actually, it's only half an hour, but I've certainly thought wider and deeper. A bit like you were saying, Maughn, with your students, you know, because you could sit down for half an hour by yourself and not get very far. But if you're in a good inquiry, by golly, you'll go a distance.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a slightly more pedantic answer than Roger's beautiful answer that he just gave, which is, and it's not meant to be instead of, it's just a different take on it, which is, you know, we can ask for like benchmarks of progress on the question. Just, you know, taking the sort of the literal idea of inquiry is, you know, moving from a question to an answer. And that can be things like, and I think it's helpful to suggest to students what those markers can include, how inclusive that can be. And of course, they can come up with more on their own, but like, did we understand that the question we started out with is a lot more complicated than we thought it was? You know, and did we go back and rephrase the question to take account of that new complexity that we discovered? That's huge progress, right? Did we come up with 2 or 3 different possible answers that all seem fairly reasonable? That's huge progress. We don't even often get that far, you know, much less narrowing down. Did we, in testing one of the answers, we came up with an important distinction that we think is highly relevant to this. Like this morning in my class, they were distinguished between privilege and fortune, like being privileged and being fortunate. So we found out that's a really important distinction in order to answer this question. That's progress.
I think there's also a thing about how we feel as facilitators. I think if we're pretty exhausted at the end of it, probably means we've been worked hard, and that's probably a good thing.
Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I want to ask the last question because I know that it's in many of our participants' minds, which is, what type of preparation do you need to be a good facilitator in P4C? So I heard when you were presenting things like, well, a facilitator needs to be a talented questioner. They have to create the right ethos of community. They have to be comfortable with silence. You know, they need to understand what makes for a philosophically rich or deep stimulus, or, you know, understanding how a question can go philosophical. So how do you prepare as a participant to be a facilitator of such a session?
I mean, the way that we try to help people learn to become facilitators is a lot through modeling. So we provide opportunities for people to come in and watch someone who's more experienced leading a session, eventually help lead the session, maybe first in small groups, participating in a smaller group of students, and then leading a session with observation and assistance from the more experienced person. I think that one of the ways you learn how to do this is by doing it yourself. And so we try to provide all kinds of opportunities for people to engage in inquiry themselves. And I mean, that was, for me, that was one of the things I really learned from Matt Littman and Ann Sharp, was kind of the, you know, learn by doing, and not model for the teachers with whom we work exactly what we're trying to have them not do, which is, you know, stand up and talk at the students. And so if we can help them to learn to be good facilitators by modeling being part of a community, and not the sort of, you know, did you say sage on the stage? Not that. Then I think that's one of the ways that people learn how to do this. But I think it's really different to facilitate a session with a group of other adults than it is to go into a classroom of 28 students and lead a philosophy session. So for us, we found that providing lots of opportunity for observation and modeling was really useful.
Hmm.
Anyone else?
Well, I'd certainly endorse that. And I think it is proper to think of facilitation as a skill or even an art, which takes time to develop. So practice is of the essence at one level. But I think there's another sense of preparing, which is sort of getting into the right zone. I was watching a sports program the other day, and the lead player was about to lead his team out. And you could see that he was mentally preparing for a huge challenge. Well, of course, that's probably very much to do with steeling yourself for a sporting challenge, so to speak. But and you don't need to steel yourself, or hopefully you don't, for facilitating an inquiry. But I do think you need to bring certain attitudes, and if you haven't got them, then you've got to get into the right mindset. So I would say, in top of the head and in a word or two, I think you just have to be not just interested in ideas and in people, but intrigued by them. And if that is your mindset, then you'll probably make a lot of mistakes, but you'll certainly be modeling the right mindset that you want everyone else to follow. And hopefully they will, if you don't make too much of a mess of it.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree with Jana and Roger. I think unless you participate in philosophical dialogue yourself, you're not going to recognise it when you're trying to facilitate it for other people. So you have to actually experience it. You have to experience it as a participant. And then I think that mentoring or training, I'm being very careful because I don't want to suggest that you can't do anything on your own. But I do think an element of training is important if you want to focus on the philosophical. If we're just talking about having a nice, strong, good dialogue, then that's something arguably different. So I think if we're talking about preparing, there are levels of preparedness. There's the, full-blown particular level of training. There's the, oh, well, maybe I'll go and familiarise myself with a bit of academic philosophy so that I actually might have a sense of what philosophy might be. Or there's the being part of a group and a community. There's the observing practitioners. There's the thinking about what stimulus might I pick that's going to prompt questions. I think we can't underestimate how well prepared you have to be to choose a good stimulus, which means trying out lots of different kinds to see what really flies. And a stimulus that works with one group doesn't necessarily work so well with another group. What kind of questions, what kind of structure do you want to impose or use within your session? I think all of these things, in the same way that we would think about preparing any activity when we're doing things with children or adults for that matter. If we were thinking about organising a party, we'd think about it carefully, but we'd also want a wee bit of free form in there as well, so that you will have fun isn't really the order of the day. So I think we have to be prepared, even if it's as simple as what structure am I going to use? How am I going to make sure that people can speak if they want to speak? And ironically, learning to shut up. I think the hardest thing for teachers, ironic, listen to us, the hardest thing for teachers is to close their mouths and let the children speak and not help them out too quickly. And the reason we do it is because we want children to do well. We want them to feel safe and supported, but actually sometimes allowing them to struggle is really, really important. And that involves us keeping our mouths shut. So I'm stopping.
I would just add really quickly that it's also keeping your mouth shut so that you're not responding to each child. like, so that it becomes just a dialogue with you.
Yeah.
Like letting, yeah.
Yeah. In Clopey, we never respond to what children say.
I'll just, I love what people are saying. I'm hearing, on the one hand, there are a lot of good ways to get training, and I fully believe that. And on the other hand, I hear us saying that we teach who we are, like Parker Palmer says. So if you're a person who's easily intrigued, and you're a person who enjoys slow thinking, what they're now calling slow thinking, you'll make mistakes, but that's what you'll be modeling.
Okay, well, we're out of time. I have loads more questions to ask all of you. Maybe we'll have a part 2. We'll see. I'd like to thank everyone for attending our webinar. PLATO is hosting another one on May 3rd from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern time in the US online. Again, we'll have a panelist talking about how to use a particular way of doing philosophy with children books. So if that's something you want to learn more about, we hope you register and see you on May 3rd. Thank you again, Jana, Claire, Roger, and Maughn for spending the time with us today.
Thanks, Ariel.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
you.
PLATO.
Thanks, everyone. Well done, Ariel. Well done, everyone. And thanks, PLATO.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.